Right, with some naphtha on a cotton bud, I'm wiping around the inside of the lens tube there, around the outside of the lens tube. That's where the main lever runs, and there's some old grease there I want to see the back of. Be very careful. Where are we? Be very careful with the slow speed, with the retard gear train. There's a hairspring on there, it's quite easily damaged. So I'm holding out the pallet lever, swing the arm across, release the pallet lever. That leaves that hairspring wound up tight, which means it's tucked in the way under the body there, less liable to be damaged. While I clean around the tube here, the lens tube, with some naphtha on a cotton bud. And it just allows me to get rid of that old grease without damaging that spring. Now I'm cleaning the top surface of the mechanism plate just to remove any obvious problems. Be cautious of this spring here. Make sure you don't damage that. You don't need to remove that from the plate typically. Though you could if you wanted to, it's just awkward and not worth the trouble. In the underside of the mechanism plate, well, this is where the blade actuating ring rotates. In the bottom surface, of course, the blades will swing across this, so that's all got to be nice and clean too. I'll run round the outside edge for good measure. That's good. Now I just want to clean my retard gear train, and I'll do that with a bit of naphtha. Wait while the video camera decides the white paper needs to be grey. I'm just running some naphtha onto those gears, hold back the pallets with my finger, swing that arm backwards and forwards, run a bit more through there, and what I'm doing is just flushing away any dirt or grease that's found its way into that retard gear train. That's all good. I just need to blow that out. So I'm just holding this at an angle, blowing it away from the mechanism plate. And there I have the mechanism plate cleaned. So I'll pop that to one side. I want to clean the blade actuating ring. That's not in a bad state. You can see a bit of dirt coming off on the cotton bud, but not a lot. That's ready to go back on. We have our two screws, which in this case were identical, I'd determined. I'll just clean those. That's fine. So, let's pop those to one side. Get rid of this paper so the camera's not flared right out. Let's have a look. Pop this back in place. There's a tab there that runs through. Where's that run through? There, I think. That looks right. I've got to tuck this under that little tab on the retard gear train. That's better. Is that dropped into place? Yeah, that's good. Okay, so that's all correct. And there are two little brass hex-headed screws. There, just having to be careful here that I don't put them in the wrong position. The heads on these brass hex-headed screws are very thin. If you are using a nut driver to try and remove them, it's going to have to be very flat at the business end. Often they are slightly recessed. You wouldn't be able to engage it with these. They're very thin. And here's our other one. Let's get that position. What I'm doing, so I'm just looking at these positions here, because this is where the blades pivot. So I'm making sure that I don't accidentally put my brass retainer in that position by mistake. Yeah, that one's not running in quite as smoothly. So what I'm doing is I'm just holding these very vertical with the tip of the tweezers and then rotating it with the toothpick to rotate it down into position. That's all good. Now taking my tweezers again. Just rotate that and it's snug. That's snug too, so they're good. That's all good. That's moving smoothly. We have the lever and its screw, and I want to clean those before I put them in place. Particularly the underside of the lever, if there was any grease in there, that would make that tend to be sticky and it wouldn't swing as freely as it needs to. That looks good. Now, typically I give this piece a tiny smear of molybdenum paste through the tiny slot where it engages with the blade actuating ring and through the pivot where the screw goes. Pop that into position. Now the smear of molybdenum paste there is extremely thin. It's almost like leaving a dirty mark on it than anything else. It's not like sticking great gobs of grease on something. I'll run the screw in. Check the action, that feels good. Tighten that screw up. I can hook its spring back over the position of on that arm. That spring's quite strong. Right. That seems nice and snappy. And that is just about done. I want to lubricate the retard gear train and the blade actuating ring with a bit of graphite powder, and having done that we can pop that to one side and deal with cleaning the blades and then getting the blades back into position. And after the blades are back into position, then the shutter case can go back over the mechanism plate, and we can flip it over and start installing the control gear from the mechanism plate. I'm just going to lubricate the mechanism plate, in particular the blade actuating ring here, with a bit of graphite powder. I'll just drop a little bit on around those positions and then swing the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards to work it in a bit. And just knock the excess off for now. I also want to lubricate the retard gear train here in much the same fashion with a bit of graphite powder. So I'll just drop some in amongst the gears there. Hold back the pallets at this end with my finger. Swing the lever backwards and forwards to work that graphite powder in. Just tap it to get rid of the excess, and I'll just go and blow that off. And that is the mechanism plate ready to go. So the blades. So I'll put the mechanism plate to one side, wait for the video camera to have its little spastic fit. Start cleaning these blades one at a time. Swabbing the blade down with naphtha on a cotton bud. I have these blades laid out in order, along with their screws that act as the pivots. Just checking the state of these blades as I do this. It's not uncommon for there to be marks on the blades, and I want to be sure that any marks there are inconsequential. No great lumps of rust, nothing of that nature. That's all good. I'll just clean the screw slightly, and this blade is our number one blade, and we have this, I'd scratch some marks on the case. 3, 2, that's 1 over here. I've just cleaned that screw. Now that's a shouldered screw, which means you've got to be very careful doing it up, that the blade is not trapped under the shoulder, that it rolls round the shoulder smoothly. That looks good. As I swing the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards, the blade will swing in and out. I've got a little tiny thread of cotton there. Hit that off, that's fine. So that's blade number one. Looks nice and clean from the front. Blade number 2 next. This one looks a bit dirtier. And the screw for this one is longer. Blade number 2. Again, it's a shouldered screw, so you have to make sure that the shoulder passes down through the blade before you tighten that thing up, otherwise the blade will not be free to swing smoothly. That looks good. Blade number 3. As I've probably said, the shutter's not particularly dirty, it's quite a clean example. The whole camera was comparatively clean. I strongly suspect that whenever the bellows struts had been mutilated in whatever fashion had been used to mutilate them, that the camera that was then tucked away in the dresser drawer, not to see the light of day again for decades and decades and decades. Get this screw in position. It's always pretty entertaining trying to get these screws to line up correctly. That's better. Alright, we have our 3 blades all correctly positioned now. So that'll blow out, get rid of that graphite powder that was floating about. That is ready to go into the case. And the case is here. We have 3 holes on the back of it for the screws. I'll just make sure they're all exposed. They line up with 3 holes on the mechanism plate. And if I figure out which ones are which, and I think it's this way. Lower that in. Alright, so I've lowered the shutter case over the mechanism plate, lined up the 3 holes. You can only align that in one position. Run that screw down very lightly. Likewise for its 2 mates. So flip it over and see what we get. Alright, well, flipping the lever, that shutter works fine. So I'll nip those 3 screws up. And that's the major work done there. You need to reassemble the rest of the components to the shutter. It's easiest if it's done with some semblance of order. So we'll start with the lever that does the T speed setting. its screw and brass bush. Alright, I'll clean these as I go. None of these components are particularly dirty, so they won't need much cleaning. Our biggest enemy here is dried grease. If you haven't got that, you generally don't have much of a problem. I'll zoom you in a bit. This lever goes in here, and its little spring hooks in behind this other little lever. That little brass bush goes on top of the blade. The screw passes through the brass bush into the mechanism plate. If we can get this positioned correctly, there it is. You can see none of that because it's all facing the wrong way, sorry. Get that screw started. Check that I've got my spring correctly hooked up so that this lever is also sprung loaded. And let's screw down a bit tighter and make sure that the bush is centered correctly. I've got my lever on the wrong side of this post, so I'm just going to loosen the screw up and see if I can swing it over the top. That's better. There you are. Now that's holding the blade open. As I move the blade actuating ring through, that dropped in. Now that's a bit sticky. Notice that lever's a bit sticky there. It should be a bit freer in its action than that. So I'm looking for the cause of that. Generally it's because something is a bit bent. Certainly not swinging as freely as it should. The spring does look a little bit out of shape at this point. I wonder whether that's some of my problem. Oh, what's happening? Let's try that. Yeah, there's a problem with that spring. It's slightly misshapen, and the screw on the case here sticks through the case just a bit far and it catches on that spring. So I'm going to take that lever out and reshape that spring till it's more to my liking. It's got quite a pronounced elbow in the middle of that spring, and I don't think it should have that. So, can I reshape that? Yeah, that's a bit flatter. And I'm looking at the lever itself to see if there's any sign that it's bent.